Two of the most famous authors of the 19th century, Charles Dickens and Mark Twain, both made their way to this river town, and it was used as an inspiration and mentioned in both of their work. At one point, this was one of the most well-known towns in the country. Word even spread to England about its mine of golden hope. A century later, big stars like Otis Redding, Sam Cooke, and B.B. King would travel through here.
'Cause the city girls give me the blues.
At one point, Cairo and Chicago were competing to become the most well-established city in the state of Illinois. Cairo had so much potential, being in between the Mississippi and Ohio. In fact, it was so well known that it was heard about all the way in England. Author Charles Dickens had come to visit in 1842, and although he was not very impressed at the time, he did come visit nonetheless. But nowadays we see a town that is very abandoned, very sad, quiet, and mysterious. And it brings up the question, before all of that, what was there? This was taken some time before 1914. If you've ever went through Cairo, you've passed through this tunnel. The floodgate would be built in 1914, which you can see in the aftershot. This is a shot of the downtown area. The railroad bridge is in the back, which actually hurt the local economy and would be the start of a downfall. This postcard gives a feel of how bustling this town was in the early 1900s. Now most of it's gone, including the metal archways. Here is one of, if not the darkest day in the history of Cairo. This was the lynching of William James, which I will get into later in this video. And the spot where he was murdered. Based on the cars, I'd say this was in the 40s or 50s, and now the Gym Theater is an abandoned shell of what it once was. The southernmost part of what is now Illinois was given a name inspired by the Nile River and Egypt. It would be named Cairo. The Mississippi and Ohio River gave the settlement amazing potential, so it would be developed as a river port that would compete with Chicago for the biggest city in the state. This town has had its place in history and pop culture from the 1800s. Author Charles Dickens had heard about this mine of golden hope all the way from England, but was repulsed with his visit. So much that in his full-length novel after his return to England, Cairo reappeared as Eden, a set of broken-down log cabins in a swamp between two rivers. The American author Mark Twain visited 40 years later, encountered with a more positive description of a brisk town that was substantially built and had a city look to it. Twain would also use Cairo as one of the primary destinations in the book Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, where Jim hoped to escape to freedom by taking a steamboat up to the state of Ohio. This may have all been inspired by the fact that Cairo was a transfer station on the Underground Railroad. And another interesting tidbit was that General Grant had a command station there during the Civil War. The town's first brush with misfortune occurred in the late 1800s when a railroad bridge was built, which hurt the market for river trade. This would be followed by major issues with race relations. Specifically in 1909, William James, a black man, was accused of murdering a white woman. A vicious mob began developing. The local sheriff tried escorting William James out of town to receive a more fair trial, but the growing mob stopped them in Karnak, Illinois, about 30 miles north. These riders brought James back to Cairo and attempted to hang him from the steel beam archway over 8th Street and Commercial Avenue. The rope snapped and he fell. When he stood up, he was shot over 500 times. And fair warning, if gruesome things disturb you, fast forward about 15 seconds. According to the documentary Between Two Rivers, his body was dragged through town, his head was cut off and put on a stake, his heart cut out, chopped up and sold as souvenirs, and his body was burned and spit on by men, women, and children. It was an unimaginable act of violence and one of the most disgusting things I've ever heard. The barbaric, bloodthirsty mob hadn't had enough, so they broke into the local jail, took out a white man by the name of Henry Salzner, who had murdered his wife, and hanged and shot him. The Illinois militia was forced to come in and end the violence in Cairo. Cairo's low elevation has always been vulnerable to flooding. Therefore, the city is surrounded by levees and flood walls, literally to the point that if southern Illinois flooded enough, Cairo would become an island. The town has had a number of impactful floods, but one of the worst was in 2011 when locals had to be evacuated. During the 1960s, we see a town that is very segregated. Power, wealth, and influence heavily favored white people. In 1967, a 19-year-old black American soldier was arrested and found hanged in his cell. The police reported it as a suicide. This story was not well accepted by the black community due to the history of the town and the history of police brutality towards people of color. The rioters demanded the truth, equality, and a stop of police brutality. A large segment of the white population of the town in response created the White Hats, which clashed with protesters. A year and a half later, Cairo civil rights activists came together to form the Cairo United Front. The group demanded a black police chief, assistant fire chief, and an equal black to white ratio in city government. After more and more fighting, the National Guard was deployed in an attempt to bring peace to Cairo. The United Front began boycotting white businesses, which forced people to move out and hurt the local economy. At this point, the population really took a nosedive. In 1978, the Interstate 57 bridge opened and even more people left on top of that. In 1987, its hospital closed, which stands to this day and has been explored by many YouTubers. In 2001, the foam factory shut its doors, and as previously mentioned, the 2011 flood forced an evacuation of the town. In 2017, a paper mill temporarily closed, but even that pushed more people out. Today, there are now less than 2,000 people who live there and many abandoned buildings. There hasn't been a new private home built in over 50 years, and the high school serves as a spot for most town meetings and functions. While it may not sound like much, in 2023, the town opened a grocery store for the first time in 7 years. Despite its turbulent history, there are good people there that still call this place home, white and black. It's a step forward and a long journey ahead to make it better. History should never be erased. It should always be told and learned from. So in conclusion, in 1836, Cairo was established. In 1842, world-renowned author Charles Dickens visits and uses it as inspiration in the book Martin Chuzzlewit for the town Eden in a non-flattering way. During the Civil War, General Grant uses a command center in Cairo. The most famous author in the United States, Mark Twain, visits in 1882 and uses the town in his book Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The railroad bridge would be constructed in 1889 and would hamper the booming river trade in Cairo. In 1903, the tunnel that we currently drive through was built, and 11 years later, the floodgate was also. In 1909, the terrible lynching of William James occurred and would leave a nasty scar in the town's history. Nearly 60 years later, we see the tensions in race relations peak with the death of soldier Robert Hunt. In 1978, the I-57 bridge is constructed and the population drops even more. The hospital closes its doors in 1987, the foam factory closes in 2001, even more people move away. An evacuation is forced due to flooding in 2011. And finally, in 2023, Cairo opens its first grocery store in 7 years. From the days of competing with Chicago and Mark Twain, the big river trade, to the ugly race relations and the shell of what it is today, this has been before and after. This is my grandmother, Mary. She grew up in Cairo, and she's actually the one that got me interested in the history of the town, and I have a few questions for her that
My experience growing up in Cairo as a young child was probably not much different than anybody else's, except for the fact that we were poor. We grew up poor. I grew up in a housing project area. We were kids that played in the neighborhood just like any place else. And one thing I notice nowadays, looking back, that the kids that I grew up with, myself included, we took a lot of pride in learning. And it started in grade school on, continued throughout junior high and high school. We had excellent teachers who tried to prepare us for the things ahead in life, knowing that we had to really work hard to excel. I mean, that was just a part of us. It was just a part of being taught what we had to do. And I'm proud to say right now that my graduating class, more than half of them are professional people now. Well, if any younger people are not aware of this, but people my age and maybe a few younger that grew up in segregation, it was not abnormal for blacks to have to go, for instance, or example, to a restaurant and go in the back of it to be served. Um, that was a kind of a commonplace thing. And many kids that I grew up with, we knew it was coming, so most of us, we didn't like it, but most of us, you know, uh, did what we had to do to get through day by day. Um, for instance, another example, when we would go to the movies, black folks had to sit in the balcony at the one theater that I remember, and didn't go to a lot of movies, but occasionally we would go. And I don't recall any particular incidents happening um, that were, hostile and that broke out into a big fight. But occasionally those things did happen.
Growing up in
Well,
Cairo.
that's a good question. I think as far as emotions go, I do have some mixed emotions about it. As a kid in my childhood, I think it was, you know, great. The interaction with other kids, my immediate neighborhood. It was all good. We had some good times there. And of course, I was basically in a neighborhood with other people who looked like me. But as I got older and left Cairo, because I left Cairo to go to college just immediately after I graduated. And then I left the area. Uh, and things were so much more different. To me, I liked them much more because the competition was more equal. And it was more equal in school, um, just in every aspect, from school to your neighborhood to your maybe going out on the town. I didn't see the stuff north, way north of Cairo that I seen as a child back when I was growing up. But they're memories, childhood memories that I will always remember, and having good times, growing up as a kid. I didn't let the segregation thing bother me a whole lot because, as I said earlier, uh, we were focused on school a lot, and a profession, um, which I see a lot of people don't really are not as motivated to me nowadays as we were growing up as kids, or a group of us anyway. Um, but it's sad that Cairo didn't flourish because it had good potential, being there right on the point of two rivers. And at one time, it was a very booming place, and I wish things could have developed there. Um, I don't know all of the problems that kept it from flourishing, but I'm sure one of them was the segregation factor.
Mm-hmm.
And But all in all, you know, I met some good people in Cairo, not only black, but some white ones too. And I, I'm thankful for all of my childhood experiences. Yes.
I think that does it, Mary. I appreciate it.
Oh, no
This is
problem,
our
Morgan.
first little interview.
Yeah, yeah.